36 hours. That is how long it took Led Zeppelin to record their debut album. In September 1968, four musicians who had barely played together walked into Olympic Studios in London. None of them fully understood what they could do in a room together. 36 hours later, they had made one of the most important debut albums in rock history. Most of them were still strangers. To understand how four men who had never performed together ended up in that studio, and why what came out of it sounded like nothing that had existed before, you have to go back to the summer of 1968, back to a band that was already over, back to a 19-year-old singing in a small venue in the English Midlands that barely anyone had heard of. Back to the beginning. In July 1968, the Yardbirds officially dissolved. The band had run its course. Internal tensions, changing members, diminishing returns. For most of the group, it was the end of a chapter. For Jimmy Page, it was a problem with an immediate deadline. Page had joined the Yardbirds in 1966 and had watched the band deteriorate around him. By the time the split came, he had already begun thinking about something new. A group built around his own vision of what rock music could be. But there were concert commitments remaining. A Scandinavian tour booked under the Yardbirds' name could not simply be cancelled. Page needed musicians. He needed a band within weeks, not months. The question was not whether to build something new. The question was who. Page's first approach for a singer was Terry Reid, a young British vocalist with a growing reputation. Reid declined. He had recently signed a solo recording deal and did not want to join another group. But before ending the conversation, Reid offered a name: Robert Plant, a 19-year-old from the West Midlands, performing with a group called Band of Joy. Reid had seen him. He believed Plant was something different. Page was skeptical. Plant was virtually unknown outside a small circuit of Midlands venues. He had recorded singles that had gone nowhere commercially. He was 19 years old, with no profile that would justify his inclusion in a band of Page's ambition. Page decided to see for himself. He drove from London to the English Midlands to watch Robert Plant perform in person. What Page saw that evening in the English Midlands was not a polished performer. Plant was raw, physically expressive, and almost absurdly confident for someone performing to a small room. But the voice, the range, the instinct, the way Plant moved between delicacy and power within a single phrase was unlike anything Page had heard from someone that young and that unknown. Page offered him the job before the night was over. Plant accepted immediately. He was 19 years old, had never toured outside England, and had spent the previous year performing to audiences a fraction of the size Page was planning for. What Plant understood even then was that what Page was building was not another mid-level British rock band. It was something with a different ambition entirely. He did not hesitate. The next problem was a drummer. Plant had an immediate answer. He and John Bonham had grown up in the same part of the English Midlands and had played together in Band of Joy. Bonham, Plant told Page, was not simply a good drummer. He was the most powerful drummer either of them had ever encountered. Someone who played with a physical force and musical intelligence that had no equivalent in British rock at that moment. The difficulty was that Bonham had other offers, including a position with Joe Cocker's touring band, which represented serious commercial work and steady income. He had a family to support and was not certain Page's new project was the better opportunity. Plant sent him telegrams, several of them. Bonham took his time before answering. While Page and Plant worked to secure Bonham, the question of a bassist remained open. It was resolved unexpectedly. John Paul Jones, one of London's most sought-after session musicians and arrangers, who had worked with the Rolling Stones, Donovan, and many others, read about Page's new project in the music press. He called Peter Grant, Page's manager, and asked to be considered. Grant and Page were surprised. Jones had no need to seek out work. His reputation in the London session world was without equal. That he had called them rather than waiting to be approached said something about what he believed this band could become. Page agreed to include him without an audition. Jones's credentials were sufficient. No further conversation was needed. In September 1968, all four men met in a rehearsal room in London for the first time. Page, Plant, Jones, and Bonham, who had finally agreed to join, set up their equipment and began to play. The accounts of what happened in that room, told separately by each of the four men in interviews across subsequent decades, are remarkably consistent. Within minutes of beginning, all four understood that something unusual was happening. The sound they produced was not simply the sum of four capable musicians. It amplified each of them. Page's guitar sounded larger, Plant's voice more powerful, Jones's bass more fundamental, Bonham's drumming more physical than any had achieved before. They played for hours. By the end of the session, the question of whether to proceed had answered itself entirely. The debut album was recorded at Olympic Studios in Barnes, London, in September 1968. The sessions moved quickly. The Scandinavian tour was approaching, time was limited, and the material was already formed in Page's mind. Page produced the album himself, with engineer Glyn Johns. The recording captured a live energy that most studio albums of the era deliberately avoided. The rhythm section, Bonham and Jones, was recorded to sound enormous, physically present rather than processed into something manageable. Plant's vocals were done largely in single takes. The entire album, 9 tracks, was completed in approximately 36 hours of studio time. What emerged was unlike anything currently on the market. Page understood this while they were still recording it. So did everyone else in the room. In September 1968, the four men toured Scandinavia under the name The New Yardbirds, fulfilling the concert obligations Page had inherited from the dissolved band. The audiences had come expecting something connected to the Yardbirds' legacy. What they encountered was different in kind, not degree. The performances were loud, extended, and deliberately pushing beyond the structures of conventional rock sets. Word moved between the Scandinavian dates. People who had seen the shows described them in terms that did not fit the standard vocabulary for rock concerts of that era. By the end of the Scandinavian run, the band understood that what they had assembled was worth naming properly. The Yardbirds' name was finished. A new one was needed. The name Led Zeppelin had its origins in a joke. Keith Moon and John Entwistle of The Who had once described a hypothetical supergroup involving Page and Jeff Beck as something that would go over like a lead Zeppelin, meaning it would sink without trace. Page and his manager Peter Grant found the image useful. They adopted it, dropping the letter A from lead to prevent mispronunciation. Led Zeppelin. The name had weight, literally and otherwise. It suggested mass, velocity, and the possibility of disaster. It turned out to be accurate in ways that went beyond music. In November 1968, the name was officially adopted. The new Yardbirds were finished. Led Zeppelin had begun. In December 1968, Led Zeppelin arrived in the United States for their first North American tour. The debut album had not yet been released. They had no American radio presence, no U.S. press coverage, and no established audience. What they had was a live performance that no one who saw it was prepared for. The early dates in Denver, Los Angeles, San Francisco produced responses the venues had not anticipated. Audiences who arrived out of curiosity left in a state closer to disbelief. Bonham's drum solos alone ran to lengths that would have tested any other audience's patience, and instead produced standing ovations. By the time the debut album was released in January 1969, the demand built on the road had already made its success a near certainty. 36 hours in a London studio. A teenage singer from the Midlands almost no one had heard of. A drummer who took convincing. A bassist who called and asked for the job himself. And a guitarist who had watched his previous band fall apart and decided in the summer of 1968 to build something that would not. Led Zeppelin would go on to sell out stadiums on 3 continents and permanently alter the course of rock music. It began in a rehearsal room in London in September 1968 with 4 people who had barely met. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Led Zeppelin Vault. Every week, we go deeper into the story of this band. Leave a comment below, and next week, we continue.